June 4, 1942. The Pacific Ocean lay like a mirror, reflecting the arrogance of empires and the silence before catastrophe. Above those waters, the Imperial Japanese Navy, once invincible, precise, and divine in its own myth, was sailing toward what it believed would be its greatest triumph. For 6 months, Japan had reigned unchallenged, its pilots hailed as gods, its admirals treated like philosophers of destiny. Yet beneath that calm, the empire was walking into a trap, woven not with bombs or bullets, but with thought. It began in the shadow of victory. After Pearl Harbor, Japan saw itself as the hand of fate, punishing a decadent West and restoring divine order to Asia. Tokyo's leaders dreamed of an eternal empire stretching from Burma to Hawaii. But in their pursuit of glory, they underestimated the most dangerous weapon of all, the human mind. Far across the ocean, in a basement beneath Pearl Harbor still smelling of oil and death, a handful of American cryptanalysts, sleep-deprived, unshaven, and ignored by their own superiors, were quietly dismantling the code that held Japan's empire together. The Japanese called their cipher JN25. It was supposed to be unbreakable, a fortress of numbers guarded by tradition and arrogance. But as Japan celebrated its victories, those walls began to crack under the relentless eyes of men who understood that war is not just fought with steel, but with patience, logic, and obsession. They did not see their enemy as monsters, they studied them as minds. And in doing so, they learned to think like them. From the Japanese side, the story is not one of evil but of tragedy. The tragedy of a nation blinded by belief, guided by honor, and betrayed by the very perfection it worshipped. When the trap was finally sprung at Midway, the empire's wings burned in 6 minutes of unimaginable destruction. The gods of war fell from the sky, and the ocean turned into a graveyard of ambition. This is not the story of victory, it is the story of awakening, the moment when the empire that believed itself eternal faced the cold intelligence of its enemy, and the myth of invincibility shattered under the weight of truth. May 27, 1942. In the depths of the Pacific, silence carried the weight of inevitability. The Imperial Japanese Navy was preparing for its next great strike. To the world, Japan was a force of divine precision, a nation reborn through discipline and sacrifice. But beneath the surface of its triumph, beneath the banners and prayers, a quiet unease had begun to grow among those who could feel what the maps could not show. Destiny was beginning to tremble. In Tokyo, admirals moved wooden ships across lacquered tables, tracing the outlines of an empire that seemed unstoppable. They believed their victories were the will of heaven itself. Their strategy was poetry, elegant, confident, inevitable. They would strike Midway, lure the remaining American carriers into a trap, and finish what began at Pearl Harbor. To them, the war was not just about conquest, it was about restoring dignity to a humiliated nation. Yet none of them could see the invisible war already raging within their own transmissions. Thousands of miles away, in a dim, humid basement beneath Pearl Harbor, the air hummed with the clatter of typewriters, fans, and exhaustion. Cigarette smoke drifted between the faces of men who had not seen daylight in days. They were cryptanalysts, mathematicians, linguists, and dreamers, all fighting the war without guns. Their leader, Commander Joseph Rochefort, wore a bathrobe instead of an E uniform. His hair was a mess, his face pale, his mind sharp enough to split atoms of meaning from chaos. He and his team were buried under cables, intercepts, and endless strings of 5-digit numbers. To the bureaucrats above, they were eccentric nuisances. To history, they were about to become the architects of Japan's undoing. But this part of the story belongs not to the victors, but to the defeated, to the men in white uniforms who believed they were instruments of destiny. Imagine a young radio operator aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, tapping out messages to the fleet. He did not know that every number he transmitted carried a whisper of his own death. He followed orders, precise and pure, never questioning the system that demanded his devotion. Like millions of others, he believed that Japan's spirit was eternal, that the gods guided their aircraft and that logic could never defeat faith. He was wrong, but his belief was absolute, and that made his fall all the more tragic. The Japanese Navy's code, JN25, was their pride. It was more than a cipher. It was a monument to order. Every message was broken into 5-digit groups, then superenciphered with additives chosen from secret books, known only to a handful of officers. The system was designed to be unbreakable. It assumed that no human mind could endure the repetition, the tedium, the madness required to find patterns in so much noise. And yet, in the basement of Station HYPO, human endurance became the weapon that broke divinity. Rochefort's team lived on coffee, cigarettes, and doubt. They argued over syllables, fought over probabilities, and often doubted their own sanity. One analyst broke down after reciting numbers in his sleep. Another swore he could hear Morse code in the sound of the ceiling fan. But through the delirium, something began to emerge. A rhythm, a heartbeat inside the noise. Every intercept was a glimpse into another world. Fleet positions, logistics, weather reports. Slowly, painfully, the Americans began to think like the enemy. They began to feel the logic behind Japanese thought, its symmetry, its restraint, its beauty. They were not breaking a code. They were learning a language of empire. At the same time, on the decks of Japan's proudest ships, the illusion of perfection began to crack. The sailors who had once shouted victory songs now whispered of exhaustion. They had been at war without rest for 6 months, their comrades buried across an ocean of graves. The pilots who had destroyed Pearl Harbor were now shadows of their former selves, heroes transformed into tools of strategy. Their officers still spoke of honor, but beneath the words lay fear. The Americans were not breaking. They were learning. What none of them could see was that the real war was already being decided, not by admirals or by the number of ships, but by the invisible minds fighting in the silence of intercepted waves. The Japanese believed they were playing chess with gods. In truth, they were playing against mathematicians. And mathematics, though heartless, never sleeps. As May turned to June, strange coincidences began to unsettle Japan's intelligence officers. American ships seemed to appear where they should not. Convoys vanished as if foreseen. Messages sent in confidence returned as tragedy. But the officers dismissed the doubts. Faith demanded obedience. To question the system was to question the emperor himself. Still, among the younger officers, unease grew. A navigator aboard the Hiryu confided to his diary, "Our plans are too perfect. Perfection is dangerous." He did not live to see how prophetic that sentence would become. Meanwhile, Rochefort's men were on the verge of revelation. They had cracked enough fragments of JN-25 to see the outline of something vast, an operation so ambitious it defied logic. It was called Operation MI. The target was coded simply as AF. No one knew what AF meant. Some said it was the Aleutians, others said Fiji. Rochefort believed it was Midway, a tiny atoll in the middle of nowhere. His superiors in Washington disagreed. They demanded proof. Here lies one of the cruelest ironies of war. The men who knew the truth were ignored, while those blinded by protocol held power. Rochefort was ordered to stop speculating. Yet speculation was all he had. His instincts, honed by months of sleepless nights, told him the Japanese were coming for Midway. But instinct is not evidence. Across the ocean in Tokyo, Yamamoto finalized the plan with chilling elegance. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would strike Midway from the northwest. The Americans, humiliated and desperate, would rush their remaining carriers to defend it. Once they did, Japan's hidden reserve force would annihilate them. The plan was perfect on paper, beautiful even, the kind of symmetry that poets dream of. But perfection is the most dangerous illusion in war. It blinds men to possibility. It seduces them into arrogance. Yamamoto, for all his brilliance, could not see that he was walking into a trap his own messages had built. As the fleets prepared to sail, men on both sides wrote letters to families they would never see again. Some spoke of duty, others of fear. The Japanese pilots carried small amulets from mothers and lovers. They did not know that the ocean waiting for them had already been mapped by men who never touched the sea. On May 27th, as the Japanese armada moved east, Rochefort's team intercepted the final clue. It was buried deep in an encrypted weather report. A minor transmission, harmless on the surface, confirmed that AF was low on fresh water. Rochefort smiled for the first time in weeks. He knew what it meant. AF was Midway. The trap could now be set. In that moment, the war became something more than strategy. It became a confrontation between faith and intellect, between tradition and adaptation, between an empire that believed in destiny and a nation that believed in analysis. Both sides were convinced they were right. Both sides would suffer for it. And so, as the Japanese fleet sailed toward its fate, the Pacific lay calm and deceptive. The gods watched in silence. The American carriers hid beyond the horizon, and in a basement beneath Pearl Harbor, the men who saw the future waited for the enemy to arrive. Because in war, knowledge is not just power, it is prophecy. The question that haunted both sides was the same. When destiny meets calculation, which one survives? December 7th, 1941. A Sunday morning that began like any other in the Pacific. The sky was calm, the air smelled of salt and sunlight, and the world was still asleep in the illusion of peace. Then, in a matter of minutes, everything changed. The sound came first, an unnatural hum, distant and growing. It was not thunder, not wind, but the beating wings of an empire. Over Oahu, the rising sun burned red on the wings of Japanese aircraft, and history shifted forever. To the Japanese pilots soaring above Pearl Harbor, it was not murder, it was destiny. They had been told that this strike would purify the world, that it would erase the humiliation of decades under Western power. They believed they were restoring balance, not destroying it. The ocean below them was not filled with enemies, it was filled with ghosts of the past. Every bomb that fell was meant to reclaim something sacred, the samurai spirit, the divine wind, the honor of their ancestors. But imagine for a moment one of those pilots, a 23-year-old, named Hiroshi. Before dawn, he had written a letter to his mother, thanking her for teaching him the value of duty. He promised her that his death, if it came, would mean something. He did not think of the men he would kill, only of the history he would restore. As he dived toward Battleship Row, the world below him exploded into fire. He saw ships torn apart, saw men running in panic, saw the American flag burning. And yet, he felt no victory, only a strange, hollow calm. He had done what honor demanded, but as he pulled up into the sky, his eyes caught the reflection of the burning harbor in the sea below. It looked less like triumph and more like hell. In that instant, Japan became both powerful and doomed. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not just a military operation, it was a psychological declaration. It told the world that Japan believed in its own destiny so completely that it was willing to gamble everything on one audacious strike. It was beautiful in its precision, terrifying in its confidence, and fatal in its consequences. Because the very thing that made Japan strong, its faith in destiny, also blinded it to the power of those who could adapt, who could learn, who could think differently. Across the ocean, America woke in disbelief. The nation that had been divided, distracted, and uncertain suddenly found a single, unshakable purpose. Factories that had been silent began to roar. Men who had never traveled beyond their hometowns volunteered to cross oceans. Women filled the factories, the hospitals, the fields. From chaos came order, from shock came resolve. While Japan believed it had destroyed its enemy's will, it had in fact created something far more dangerous, a collective intelligence driven by vengeance and necessity. Back in Tokyo, the architects of the attack celebrated in silence. They had accomplished what no other Asian power had dared. They had struck at the very heart of the West. But beneath the applause there was unease. Admiral Yamamoto, the man behind the operation, sat alone in his office, smoking in the dark. He knew America too well. He had studied there, walked its streets, seen its spirit. He once said, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." It was not poetry, it was prophecy. The Japanese people, meanwhile, were swept into a tide of belief. Newspapers declared the empire invincible. Children sang songs of victory in classrooms. Housewives prayed for their sons and husbands, convinced that Japan's cause was sacred. For a while, it felt true. City after city fell before Japan's advance. The empire expanded across Asia like a rising tide, but tides always recede. The first to feel it were not the generals, but the ordinary men, the radio operators, the deckhands, the mechanics, those who lived in the long hours between battles. One mechanic, stationed on a carrier bound for Midway, wrote in his diary, "We win every battle, but the faces around me grow older every day. Victory feels heavy now. It is in those small moments that war reveals its truth. The same can be said for life. We chase success, power, perfection, believing that victory will bring peace. But sometimes, the pursuit of perfection becomes the source of our downfall. The Japanese believed they could not fail because their purpose was pure. Yet purity without reflection becomes blindness. For the American cryptanalysts in the basement of Pearl Harbor, this blindness became their opportunity. Every intercepted message, every careless repetition, every small deviation, these became clues. They did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as students of the enemy's mind. The Japanese transmitted messages with ritualistic precision, never realizing that the predictability of faith was its weakness. Every time they followed the same linguistic rhythm, they left behind a footprint, and soon those footprints began to form a trail leading directly to Midway. From the Japanese side, the mood began to change. The victories were still real, but the tone was different. Officers spoke less of glory, more of endurance. Supplies were harder to find. Fuel, food, and faith began to run thin. The empire's expansion had reached its limits, but no one dared to say it aloud. To question victory was to betray the emperor, and so silence grew, the silence before the storm. History often feels distant, like a story that happened to someone else, but the psychology of this moment is not foreign. We've all lived some version of it. The moment when confidence becomes overconfidence, when success blinds us to change, when we stop listening, believing we already know the answers. Whether in war, business, or our own lives, the same truth applies. The moment we think we are untouchable is the moment we begin to fall. For Japan, that moment began with the sound of cheering crowds. For the men in the basement at Pearl Harbor, it began with the sound of Morse code. Two sounds, both human, both filled with conviction, and yet one was the echo of the other. In the quiet between them lay the fate of millions. There is something haunting about knowing how it ends. The Japanese fleet that believed itself guided by the gods would soon vanish in smoke and fire. The men who carried their faith into battle would fall not because they were weak, but because they trusted too deeply in certainty. That is the most painful kind of loss, the loss that comes from believing too much. And perhaps that is why we cannot look away from stories like this, because they remind us that greatness, when left unchecked, becomes tragedy. That strength without humility breeds destruction, and that even in defeat there is something profoundly human, a reminder that the pursuit of meaning, though it may fail, is what gives life its shape. Before we move forward in this story, pause for a second. Think of Hiroshi, the young pilot who believed in destiny. Think of Rochefort, the man in the bathrobe, chasing truth through madness. Two men, on opposite sides of an ocean, both trapped by belief, both trying to give sense to chaos. Their world is gone, but their struggle is ours. The same forces, faith, logic, pride, doubt, still guide every decision we make. And if you felt something while listening to this, if you've seen a reflection of yourself in their choices, their mistakes, or their courage, then let this story continue. Click the red button in the corner of your screen. Subscribe, not just to follow this series, but to follow the deeper truth that connects us all. That every empire, every victory, every loss begins and ends in the same place, the human mind. Because what comes next is not just history, it is the unraveling of destiny itself. June 1st, 1942. The Pacific was vast, beautiful, and silent, hiding within it the greatest deception in modern history. Japan believed it was preparing for victory. Its admirals studied maps and charts with the calm of chess masters, but what they did not know was that their every move, every coded word, every intention was already echoing through American ears. In a basement beneath Pearl Harbor, men who had not slept in days listened to the whispers of an empire convinced of its own perfection. Commander Joseph Rochefort leaned over his desk, a cigarette burning down to ash, his eyes fixed on a page of numbers that seemed meaningless to anyone but him. He was chasing ghosts, trying to extract truth from chaos. He knew that somewhere inside those 5-digit patterns, Japan had hidden its soul. Every time he thought he saw a pattern, it vanished again, replaced by new layers of confusion. Yet his mind refused to stop. His war was not against Japan, it was against uncertainty itself. Across the ocean aboard the carrier Akagi, a different kind of certainty reigned. The Japanese officers believed their code, JN-25, was divine in design, complex enough to defeat human reason. To them, logic could never overcome faith. They believed that the gods had written their destiny, that their victory was inevitable. But destiny, like any system, begins to crack when examined by those who refuse to believe in it. As Rochefort's team worked through the night, something extraordinary began to happen. The chaos started to breathe. They noticed that certain number groups repeated in a rhythm that mirrored natural language. It was as if the code itself had a heartbeat. Each repetition became a clue, each small coincidence a thread. Slowly, painfully, the men began to unravel what had once seemed divine. But what if they were wrong? What if their conclusions led Nimitz to disaster? The thought haunted them. The weight of it sat heavy in their chests. If they misread the code, thousands would die. Yet, if they stayed silent, the Japanese would strike unchallenged. Every new discovery carried a shadow of fear, a reminder that intelligence is not certainty. It is courage wrapped in doubt. Rochefort's second-in-command, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, once said, "We aren't solving puzzles. We're listening to a language that doesn't want to be heard." And he was right. The Japanese code was not just mathematics. It was philosophy, culture, and psychology encoded into numbers. Each pattern reflected the disciplined mind of its creator, a mirror of the empire itself. Breaking it meant more than victory. It meant understanding how an entire civilization thought. Meanwhile, Japan prepared for Operation MI. The ships departed from Hashirajima under a rising sun that seemed to bless their journey. Crews bowed toward the emperor's portrait before setting sail. They sang songs of loyalty, their faith unshaken. To them, this was not simply another battle, it was the fulfillment of a divine promise. They would destroy what remained of the American Navy and secure Japan's rightful place in history. No one on those decks knew that their sacred plan was already compromised. How could they? They had followed every rule, every procedure, every ritual. The radio officers used the same call signs they always had. The commanders sent their orders in perfect order, confident that no foreigner could possibly interpret them. And yet, every message they sent was another piece of their own undoing. In the HYPO basement, exhaustion turned into revelation. A seemingly meaningless message, one about water supplies, caught Rochefort's attention. It mentioned AF, the mysterious location that Japan planned to attack. Washington believed AF was Alaska, but Rochefort disagreed. He argued that AF was Midway. No one believed him. To the bureaucrats, his methods seemed chaotic, unscientific, emotional. But intelligence work is rarely clean. It is made of intuition, obsession, and leaps of faith. Rochefort knew he was right, but how could he prove it? The answer came from deception. His colleague Jasper Holmes proposed a plan so simple it bordered on madness: send a false message from Midway claiming that their water plant had broken. If Japan's next coded transmission mentioned water shortages at AF, they would have their proof. Rochefort agreed. They sent the bait. Days later, the Japanese broadcasted exactly what they had hoped to hear. AF is short on water. In that moment, the code broke open like a shell. The truth was undeniable. Imagine the silence in that room when the confirmation arrived. The air stopped moving. The typewriters froze. For the first time in months, the impossible had become clear. AF was Midway. The Japanese fleet was coming. Nimitz now had what Yamamoto thought he alone possessed, knowledge of the future. But here is the question that lingers. How did faith turn into blindness? How does certainty make us deaf to what is right in front of us? The Japanese officers who sent those messages were not foolish. They were brilliant, educated men. Yet they trusted too deeply in their system, believing that precision could replace reflection. They forgot that perfection is the most fragile state of all. Yamamoto himself was a man divided between logic and loyalty. He knew that attacking Midway carried immense risk, but he was trapped by his own creation, the military machine that demanded perfection, the emperor's court that expected miracles. To hesitate would be dishonor. To doubt was betrayal. And so he advanced, carrying not only his fleet, but the weight of an entire nation's belief. Back in Pearl Harbor, Nimitz read the decrypted reports and made his decision. He would trust the men in the basement. He would act on the fragile human work of exhausted minds over the polished logic of Washington's bureaucrats. He positioned his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown, north of Midway in the empty sea. There he would wait. It was a gamble so great that even his closest advisors questioned his sanity. But history favors those who dare to trust understanding over protocol. On both sides of the ocean, men were preparing for a battle they did not yet understand. The Japanese believed in destiny. The Americans believed in reason. But what if neither was enough? What if the truth was something in between? A fragile dance between intuition and chaos, where survival depended on seeing not what was expected, but what was hidden. As the fleets moved closer, the Pacific remained indifferent. The same waters that carried Japan's dreams now carried the instruments of its destruction. The men aboard those ships looked out over endless blue horizons, unaware that the ocean beneath them was listening, recording their every heartbeat, every hope, every signal. Somewhere in that silence, amid the tension of calculation and faith, the future was being written, not by admirals or emperors, but by the quiet persistence of human minds refusing to surrender to destiny. And as the final messages crackled through the air, both sides waited for confirmation of what they already feared, that the battle to come would not be one of strength, but of understanding. The war had shifted. The weapons had changed. The next blow would be delivered not by steel, but by the invisible power of thought, because sometimes the most dangerous weapon in war is not the one you hold, it's the truth you refuse to see. June 3rd, 1942. The Pacific sky was empty, blue, and full of deceit. Beneath its stillness, 2 worlds prepared to collide. The Imperial Japanese Navy, proud and confident, sailed under the rising sun, believing their enemy broken. Across the ocean, 3 American carriers waited in silence, hidden by distance, darkness, and intelligence. The men aboard did not know if they were walking into victory or death. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The Japanese fleet was a masterpiece of discipline. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu sailed in perfect formation, surrounded by cruisers, destroyers, and battleships. They had dominated the Pacific for half a year, sinking or crippling every fleet that stood before them. More than 350 aircraft were ready for battle. Their pilots were the elite of the empire, men who had turned aerial warfare into a form of art. Each believed he carried the emperor's will in his hands. Each believed the Americans would fall as easily as before. What none of them knew was that their secret operation had already been read by men in a basement thousands of miles away. The Americans were waiting exactly where Japan believed they were weakest. Every signal, every word, every coordinate had betrayed them. In the coming days, the gods of war would fall from the sky. At dawn on June 4th, Japanese planes struck Midway Atoll. The sky turned black with smoke and flames. Buildings shattered, oil tanks burned, and defenders ran between explosions. From the Japanese perspective, it seemed another perfect strike. The radio operators reported success. The pilots shouted victory, and Admiral Nagumo believed the Americans were on their knees. But the illusion of control lasted only minutes. Far beyond the horizon, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown, were already launching their planes. History often remembers battles as stories of strength and numbers, but the Battle of Midway was a story of timing and faith. Within minutes, the balance of power in the Pacific would shift forever. At 9:20 a.m., Japanese reconnaissance spotted the American carriers. Nagumo hesitated. His aircraft were still being refueled and rearmed for a second strike. His decks were covered in torpedoes and bombs. He had 2 choices: attack immediately with half-prepared planes, or wait and rearm for a decisive blow. He chose to wait. That hesitation, no longer than 5 minutes, changed the world. While Nagumo debated, American dive bombers were closing in. The attack was chaotic. Torpedo squadrons arrived first, uncoordinated and unsupported. Out of 41 American torpedo planes, 35 were shot down. It was a massacre. The sea was covered with wreckage and oil. The Japanese gunners cheered as the last torpedo bomber fell flaming into the water. They believed the threat was over. But they never saw what came next. At 10:22 a.m., from a break in the clouds, 37 dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown appeared directly above the Japanese fleet. They dove almost vertically, engines screaming, the sun at their backs. The Japanese carriers, filled with fuel, bombs and aircraft, had no time to react. In 6 minutes, 3 of them, Akagi, Kaga and Soryu, were transformed into infernos. Explosions tore through the decks, men were thrown into the sea, and the air filled with the sound of burning steel and human screams. 6 minutes. That was all it took to end Japan's dream of invincibility. Only one carrier remained, Hiryu. Her commander, Tamon Yamaguchi, refused to surrender. He launched a counterattack that struck the Yorktown, setting her ablaze, but the damage was already done. Later that afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu and destroyed her as well. The once perfect formation of Japan's carrier fleet was now a floating graveyard. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were dead, 4 carriers gone, ships that had taken years to build, and men who could never be replaced. The statistics of Midway tell a story too vast to ignore. Japan lost 4 of its 6 main carriers. America lost 1. Japan lost 248 aircraft. America lost 150. But the numbers do not show the true cost. Japan lost its strategic initiative. Its best pilots, the men trained for years, were gone. They could build new ships, but they could not rebuild experience. For the first time since the war began, Japan's leaders faced a truth they could not deny. The empire was mortal. Yet, even in defeat, there was dignity. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship. When given the chance to evacuate, he refused, telling his men, "The Emperor will not need me in the next world if I leave my post in this one." His final words were calm. "Let us sink with honor." Hiryu burned through the night until it vanished beneath the waves. The ocean accepted them all without judgment. But what does victory mean when both sides are consumed by loss? The Americans who returned to their carriers were not cheering. Many wept silently. They had killed men they could not see, men who believed as deeply in their cause as they did. They understood that in 6 minutes of triumph, thousands of lives had ended. War had no heroes, only survivors. Across Japan, the news of the defeat was kept secret for weeks. Newspapers spoke only of glorious sacrifice, not of loss. But among the officers, the truth spread like a shadow. Yamamoto, the architect of the war, received the report in silence. He looked out over the sea and whispered, "The war has been decided." He knew the empire would never recover, and yet duty required him to continue. The machinery of war does not stop for human doubt. Globally, Midway changed the rhythm of history. In 1942, Japan controlled more than 7 million square kilometers across Asia and the Pacific. Its armies had conquered Hong Kong, the Philippines, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. But after Midway, the expansion stopped. From that moment, every battle Japan fought was defensive. The empire that once seemed destined to rule the Pacific began its slow, irreversible collapse. Still, the Japanese soldiers and sailors did not stop believing. They fought on with the same discipline and faith that had carried them from the beginning. To them, surrender was worse than death. Even as supplies dwindled and hope faded, they continued to fight as if the gods might still intervene. It is one of history's greatest paradoxes, that the same faith which gives humans strength can also blind them to the truth. As 1943 began, Japan's leadership faced an impossible question. How do you lead a nation that cannot admit defeat? Factories still produced aircraft and ships, but fuel was scarce, and the Americans now controlled the skies. Japan's military schools continued to teach the code of Bushido, urging young men to embrace death rather than capture. Every boy dreamed of becoming a pilot, not to win, but to die beautifully. The empire that once sought eternity had become a nation, preparing for collective sacrifice. Meanwhile, the Americans grew stronger. Industrial output tripled. The United States was producing more aircraft each month than Japan could build in a year. Women worked in factories, children collected metal for the war effort, and the entire nation seemed to move in rhythm toward victory. Technology, not destiny, had become the new god. But perhaps the most unexpected truth about Midway is how much of it was luck. A single shift in the wind, a delayed launch, a lost scout plane, any of these could have changed the outcome. History is often decided not by perfection, but by chance. Yet the Japanese refused to believe in chance. They believed in order, hierarchy, destiny, and destiny does not forgive imperfection. After Midway, Japan's strategy turned desperate. They fortified islands, building airstrips and bunkers on coral reefs that became names etched in history: Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima. Each battle cost thousands of lives. The empire that had risen with precision now drowned in blood. Still they fought. Still they believed. When the survivors of Midway returned to Japan, many were met not with honor, but with silence. Their failure was too painful to acknowledge. Some officers were reassigned. Others, like Yamamoto, continued to lead until their deaths. In April 1943, his plane was shot down by American fighters who had decoded his travel plans, the same kind of intelligence that had doomed his fleet at Midway. His death was poetic, inevitable, and tragic. The man who believed in destiny had become its final victim. For the rest of the world, Midway became a symbol. For the Allies, it was hope, a reminder that the tide could turn. For Japan, it was the beginning of a long descent into darkness, and for those who study history, it remains a lesson that victory is rarely about strength alone. It is about adaptation, understanding, and the courage to see what others refuse to see. As the flames of the carriers faded beneath the waves, the Pacific returned to silence. The ocean, indifferent to human ambition, erased the evidence of glory and failure alike. The men who died believed they were shaping eternity. They did not know that eternity would forget them. In the end, Midway was not just a battle. It was a mirror held up to humanity itself, a reflection of how belief can build empires and how knowledge can destroy them. It showed that the line between faith and blindness is thinner than we wish to admit. And it proved once again that even in war, the greatest victories are born not of power, but of understanding. Because in those 6 minutes of chaos, the future of the world changed forever, and not a single man among them knew it. August 1945. The war was ending, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was exhaustion. Japan lay in ruins, its cities burned, its people starving, its spirit broken, but still proud. The empire that had once promised eternity now existed only in memories and ashes. Children walked barefoot through what had been Tokyo, carrying buckets of water to where their homes once stood. Mothers sewed clothes from the uniforms of the dead. The air smelled of smoke and surrender. For many, the war was no longer about victory or defeat. It was about survival. The soldiers who returned came back as ghosts. They were men who had seen too much, men who had believed too deeply. Some could not speak about what they had witnessed. Others refused to. They had fought for an ideal, honor, loyalty, the divine destiny of their nation, and found themselves instead in a landscape of ruin. What does a man do when the faith that once guided him becomes the reason for his suffering? Many of them never found the answer. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the end came not with surrender, but with fire. In seconds, the sky turned into light. Tens of thousands vanished in a flash. Their shadows burned into stone. The survivors, the hibakusha, carried scars not only on their skin, but in their souls. They were reminders that even victory can be monstrous. The bombs ended the war, but they also began a new kind of fear, one that still defines humanity today. For the first time, we learned that we could destroy ourselves completely. Yet even in that devastation, life began again. Farmers returned to their fields. Children went back to school. The survivors of Hiroshima planted trees where the blast had leveled everything. The cherry blossoms that bloomed the following spring became symbols of quiet defiance, proof that beauty could exist even after the world had ended. Japan rebuilt not through conquest, but through reflection. It learned that strength was not the ability to dominate, but the ability to endure. There is something profoundly human in the story of Japan after the war. The same nation that once worshipped its own invincibility became a messenger of peace. The same people who had believed in destiny came to understand humility. History often remembers the victors, but wisdom belongs to those who lose and rise again. Because loss, though painful, strips away illusion. It reveals what truly matters. Think for a moment about the men who fought on both sides. The American pilot who dropped his bombs, believing he was ending suffering. The Japanese pilot who died, believing he was defending his homeland. Both were young, both were afraid, both were wrong. and yet both were right in their own way. War is not a story of heroes and villains. It is a story of humans trying to give meaning to chaos, and perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that knowledge without empathy leads to destruction, and empathy without knowledge leads to blindness. The war showed us that progress without morality becomes a weapon, and faith without reason becomes madness. It is easy to judge the past from the safety of the present, but the truth is that we are all capable of repeating it. The seeds of war are not only in nations, they are in us, in our pride, our fears, our desire to be right. When the war finally ended, Japan's surrender was not just political, it was spiritual. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito spoke to the nation for the first time in history. His voice, trembling and distant, told his people that the time had come to bear the unbearable. For many, it was the first time they heard him as a man, not a god. That single moment, an emperor admitting human weakness, was the true end of the empire, and it was the beginning of something better, honesty. In the years that followed, Japan rebuilt faster than anyone thought possible. Its cities rose from ashes. Its culture, once silenced by censorship and control, began to sing again. But the scars remained, quiet reminders in every generation that the price of blind obedience is tragedy. Today, Japan's peace constitution stands not as weakness, but as wisdom written in blood. It says that war can no longer be justified by pride, only by memory. What about us? What do we learn from this story? The world we live in was born from that war. The peace we enjoy was built by people who had lost everything. The technologies we use, the systems we trust, even the alliances we depend on, all trace back to those 6 violent years. We like to believe we are different now, that we have evolved. But the same forces that led to that destruction still exist. Ambition, fear, power, faith. The real question is not whether history will repeat itself, but whether we will recognize it when it begins. There are lessons hidden in every battle, every mistake, every act of courage and cruelty. The story of World War II is not just about nations, it is about individuals. The mother who lost her child, the soldier who lost his faith, the scientist who built the bomb but could not sleep afterward. Their stories live on, quietly reminding us that war is not a relic of the past. It is a reflection of ourselves when we forget to listen. If this story has moved you, if you have felt sorrow, anger, or even hope, then let it do what history is meant to do. Make you think. Reflect on the cost of pride, the power of understanding, and the fragility of peace. Because peace is not the absence of war, it is the presence of empathy. Before this story fades into silence, remember the faces of those who lost everything and still found the strength to rebuild. Remember that their suffering bought the peace we take for granted. Remember that the true enemy is never another nation. It is ignorance, arrogance, and indifference. And if these words have reached you, if you believe stories like this matter, then help keep them alive. Subscribe to the channel, click the red button. Like this video if you believe history should be remembered not as glory, but as warning. Share your thoughts or questions in the comments, even anonymously if you wish. Every reflection, every voice, every memory is a small act of resistance against forgetting. Because remembrance is not about looking back. It is about ensuring we never walk that same road again.